This is Warrior Kid Podcast number 16, Ask Uncle Jake. And this podcast is based on the two Way of the Warrior Kid books. The first one is called Wimpy to Warrior, the Navy SEAL Way. And the second one, Mark's Mission. And the books are about young Mark, who faces a lot of the problems that kids everywhere face. But Mark gets some help solving those problems from his Uncle Jake, who was a Navy SEAL and who stays with Mark in the summertime. And this podcast is for kids to hear some more lessons from Uncle Jake and also get a chance to ask Uncle Jake some questions. But today is a little bit different because today we have our first guest on the Warrior Kid podcast. He is a friend of mine and his name is Dave Burke. And Dave was a fighter pilot in the United States Marine Corps. He flew jet planes faster than the speed of sound. And he also worked on the ground during war, talking to aircraft overhead on a radio to tell the pilots in the sky how they could help the troops on the ground. And so, Dave, thanks for coming on the show. And we have some questions for Dave and also some questions for Uncle Jake as well. So the first question for Dave: some people want to become Navy SEALs, but you wanted to become a fighter pilot. Why?
Well, I always liked planes as a kid. I remember as a little kid, I saw the X-Wing fighter in Star Wars, and I thought flying would be a lot of fun. I also liked the military. I played with military toys when I was a little kid. I'd go to air shows, and I see military pilots, and I thought what they were doing was really cool, and that's something I wanted to do. And when I found out that military pilots, they fly in war and they help people on the ground, I thought that was a perfect job for me. I really liked the military. I really liked airplanes. And when I found out that I could do both, I knew as a little kid I wanted to be a pilot.
Now here's a question. Someone asked, why didn't Uncle Jake want to be a pilot? Well, I can tell you that Uncle Jake, I never really liked relying on big machines. So I didn't want to drive a tank or a ship or an airplane. I more wanted to rely on myself and the other people that were with me. Plus, growing up, I spent a lot of time in the woods, and I always liked being outside with nature and with the ocean more than I liked being in a car or in a boat or in a plane. But, you know, that's just what I liked. And I was always glad that there were guys like Dave and other pilots in the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and Coast Guard that wanted to fly because I didn't really want to. Here's the next question. This one's for Dave. Dave, what is the scariest thing about being a Marine Corps fighter pilot, and how did you overcome that fear?
Well, flying is actually mostly fun, but just like any job, there are things that can happen that are scary. Like in an airplane, sometimes if something breaks or if you have an emergency. Flying in really bad weather when it's cloudy and rainy can actually be kind of scary. But for me, the most scared I ever was in an airplane was when I was landing an airplane on an aircraft carrier at night. Now, if you know anything about aircraft carriers, they're really cool and they're really big boats, but actually they're very small runways. And I remember the first time I was supposed to land on the aircraft carrier at night. It was really dark and I couldn't see it, and I got scared. And I was really worried because you have to be really precise when you land on an aircraft carrier. If you're just a little bit too high, you got to go around and you can't land. I didn't want to do that. But if you're a little bit too low, you can actually crash. And I really didn't want to do that. So when I found myself getting scared, I did actually two things. The first thing I did is I remembered that there are always things about jobs that you don't necessarily want to do. And sometimes you're going to do things that you don't enjoy, like studying for a test or maybe cleaning up your gear after a baseball game, things that aren't all that fun, but you actually have to do them. And if I wanted to do the fun things like flying fast and dropping bombs and shooting my gun, I had to land on an aircraft carrier. But the other thing I did was I did a lot of practice. I would volunteer for all the night flights. I would do to the simulator, which is like a mock-up airplane where I could practice and train. And sometimes I'd literally just sit in a chair, close my eyes, and pretend to land on an aircraft carrier. And I got pretty good at it after a while. And I got used to it, and that fear started to go away, and I got a little more comfortable. And believe it or not, even flying at night in a carrier for me actually got to be fun in the end.
That's good. I have seen aircraft carriers from the sky, and it seems like it's a really small place to try and land a plane. That's for sure. Next question is for Uncle Jake. What's better, a Navy SEAL or a Marine? That's a question that a lot of people like to ask. But when it comes to anyone in the military, whether they're regular Navy sailors or SEALs or Marines or Army soldiers or people in the Air Force or the Coast Guard, there's no one that's better than the other. They all just have different jobs. And all the different jobs are important. So while SEALs might be better at clandestine scuba diving operations, the Marines are definitely better at big amphibious landings. Every group has something that they are better at, and all the different jobs are equally important. And so some people then ask, well, who has the hardest training? A lot of people ask that question. Who has the hardest training? And that actually depends on the person that's going through the training. So for instance, in SEAL training, you swim and you scuba dive and you spend a ton of time in the water, in the ocean, in the pool. And if you don't like the water, it is going to be very, very hard. Another example is Ranger School. During Ranger School, they do not feed you very much at all. They don't give you much to eat. So if you don't like being hungry, that school is going to be very, very hard. And in Special Forces, for instance, they focus a lot on learning foreign languages. So if you aren't good at learning languages, or you don't like studying hard, that school for you is going to be very, very hard. So all the different military branches have very challenging training. It just depends on who you are and what you like as to what would be the hardest. And the next question is for Dave. And it is, I know that to be a fighter pilot, you have to get good grades in school. Was it hard for you to get good grades, and how did you do it?
Well, yes, it is important to get good grades if you want to be a fighter pilot. Actually, it's important to get good grades for almost any job. And I actually did pretty good in a lot of my classes. Some of them came really easy to me, and it was very easy to get an A. But some classes actually weren't easy for me. And believe it or not, my hardest class was math. And it didn't come easy at all for me. And math is really important if you want to be a pilot. You have to use it all the time. You have to calculate how much gas you have, how far you can go, really everything. So my worst subject was actually the one that mattered the most for me to be a pilot. And you know what I did? I did the same thing that Mark did. I made note cards. I did all the practice questions in my math book. My mom got me a tutor for a couple of classes. And I even made friends with the smartest kid in my math class, my friend Peter, and he actually taught me how to do math in one of my classes. And all I did was work really hard. I didn't always get good grades in math. I didn't get A's, but I learned and I passed, and the teacher saw that I put in a lot of effort, and it turns out that helped me a lot because I use math on every flight I ever had.
You have to study if you're going to get good.
You do.
And we have another question for Dave. This question is, do you train Jiu Jitsu? Do you like it? And why?
I do train Jiu Jitsu, and actually I like it a lot. It's become one of my favorite things to do. And you know, I like it for a lot of reasons, and I could go through all of them. But the thing of it is that Jiu Jitsu actually reminds me of flying. I know that sounds kind of weird, but they're very similar. And when you're flying, you have to use your brain all the time. And that's the same thing in Jiu Jitsu. And when you're flying, sometimes you're right side up, sometimes you're upside down, and usually you're twisting and turning the whole time, and that's just like Jiu Jitsu. And the plane that wins when you're flying isn't always the fastest plane, and the person that wins in Jiu Jitsu isn't always the strongest person. So I found a whole bunch of things about flying that reminded me of Jiu Jitsu. Another reason I like it is it's really good exercise. I am really tired when I'm done with Jiu Jitsu, and I'm really sweaty. But as tired and as sweaty as I am, I usually feel really good, and that's exactly how I felt when I was flying airplanes. So yeah, I love Jiu Jitsu.
That is good. I got one more question for Dave. The question is, you have 3 kids. What is the most important quality that you try and teach your kids to have?
I do have 3 kids. I have 2 girls and a boy. I love them very much. And there's actually a lot of things I try to teach them. I want them to be nice and respectful. I want them to be humble and fair and courteous, and I want them to work hard. There's actually 2 things I can think of that I want to teach my kid that are the most important, and they're kind of related. One is to always be honest, and the other is to take responsibility for the things that happen. And I think it's really important never to lie, never to cheat, and that being honest is probably the most important quality in children and really in adults. And so when you're honest about things like if you break a toy or if they get in trouble at school, I teach them to take responsibility for it. You can't blame other kids or blame other people what happened to you or your things. And that is how being honest and being responsible are related. The kids who are honest and take responsibility, they grow up to be adults who are honest and take responsibility. And what I learned is that adults who are honest and take responsibility are usually really successful. And I want my kids to be successful, so that's why I think those are the 2 most important things I can teach them.
That is awesome. And that is all we had for questions. And I wanted to read a quick story that was written by Uncle Jake about when he was a kid and he learned something about life. And since we had a fighter pilot on the podcast today, Uncle Jake wanted to tell a story about a fighter pilot that he knew when he was a kid. And this fighter pilot taught Uncle Jake some very important lessons. So here is a story from Uncle Jake. When I was a kid, I had a kid in my 4th grade class named Jonathan that sat behind me in class. He wasn't really my friend, but he was friends with some of my friends. And this boy, Jonathan, used to talk all the time. Talk, 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 talk. And it really annoyed me. Not only did he talk, but he had a voice that kind of came out through his nose, and it made it even more annoying. He would say, "Hey, what are you guys doing? What are you up to? What are you doing? What's happening? How are you guys doing?" Nonstop, all the time. And the more I was around him, the more I got annoyed. Sometimes I even got angry. And one day it really started to get to me, so I told him to just be quiet. And he was quiet for a little while, but not for very long. And then it was talk, 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 talk again. Talk, talk, talk. I couldn't stand it. It was so aggravating. Finally, one day I got super annoyed. We were sitting on the ground during reading time, and I was just trying to read, and he kept talking. I'd had enough, and I finally looked at him, and I said, "Would you just shut your mouth?" Only instead of saying it quietly because I was so mad, it came out way too loud. So loud that everyone in the classroom heard me say it, including the teacher. And my teacher did not like that at all, and I got in trouble. The teacher, Mrs. Talley was her name. She came over and sent me to the principal's office. I was the one that got sent to the principal's office, even though it was Jonathan that had been talking. Now what was I going to do? As you can imagine, the principal called my house and told my parents I had been in trouble. Now, pay attention here because I have to tell you another part of the story. It's a story within a story, but it will lead back to Jonathan and how that whole situation turned out. You see, there was a man that used to come over to our house sometimes. He was older than my dad, but not by much. My dad called him Captain. The captain had been in the Navy, but he didn't drive ships. He was a pilot in the Navy. He flew planes, and during the Vietnam War, his plane was shot down and he parachuted to the ground, but when he landed, he was surrounded by the enemy and they captured him and put him into a prisoner of war camp, and it was an awful place. There was horrible food and they didn't get much of it, and the water made them sick, and they lived in barren rooms called prison cells, and it was hot and it was miserable. And the prisoners were treated horribly by the guards in the prison. They were beaten and they were starved and they were given no freedom to do anything. The only good thing that the prisoners had is that they were not alone. There were other prisoners there. mostly other pilots that had been shot down, and most of the time they lived with each other in these tiny prison cells. I only knew about all this because my dad had told me what had happened to the captain. Well, after I got in trouble at school for getting annoyed at Jonathan, who talked all the time, and I yelled at him, my dad invited the captain over to my house. And my dad said that the captain wanted to tell me something. And when we sat down after dinner, the captain looked at me and started to talk. And when the captain talked, everybody listened. The captain spoke slowly and clearly, and you could tell that he meant every word he said. And this is what he told me that night. He said, "Jake, I know you got into some trouble at school. I know you got annoyed with another kid and yelled at him during class. Now I want to tell you something. When I was a fighter pilot, I was shot down and got captured by the enemy. I was put into a prison camp, and it was a horrible place. And in that prison, we had cellmates. Those were the other prisoners that we lived with. And the rooms were small, and we were hungry, and we were sick, and we were tired, and we were miserable. And in that terrible situation, it would be very, very easy for me to get annoyed with my cellmates. In fact, we all could have gotten annoyed with each other. Maybe my cellmate snored, or maybe he coughed all day and all night, or maybe he cracked his knuckles all the time, or picked his nose, or scratched his feet in a gross way that made me really annoyed. But Jake, I was in that prison camp with those other guys for 6 years. 6 years. That is a long, long, long time to be in prison, and that is a long, long, long time to be annoyed. And in that prison, we didn't have many other choices for friends. It was just us and our cellmates. That's it. So we came up with a rule. And the rule was that if someone annoyed us, it wasn't their fault. It was our fault. It was our fault if we let their snoring bother us. If my roommate snored, it was my fault if I let that bother me. It was my fault if I got aggravated at the way my cellmate scratched his feet. It was my fault if I couldn't stand the way that my cellmate coughed or talked or cracked his knuckles. It was my fault. That was the rule. We couldn't allow ourselves to get annoyed. Being annoyed would have made that prison much, much worse than it already was, and we couldn't have that. And we didn't have that. Ever. So, Jake, if you let someone annoy you, you're allowing something that shouldn't control you to control you. You're letting it get inside your head. And I know you're young, but that's no excuse. You can't do that. You have to learn to ignore the little things that annoy you. I promise you that there are enough things in life that can go wrong, big things, important things that you'll have to worry about. So don't let these little things bother you. Just accept them and shake them off. Think about something else. And don't focus on little things that annoy you, but that don't really matter. Does that make sense to you, Jake? And I said to the captain, "Yes, sir." And I meant it. I couldn't believe what the captain had been through, and I couldn't believe that he had this amazing attitude. I could see in him how strong you have to be to stay calm and not let things annoy you. It made me feel like I was a giant wimp for letting little things bother me. And that was the first lesson that I learned from the captain. And he taught me much, much more over the years, and I'll tell you more about those lessons later. But this first lesson, it was an important one. And after that, when I went back to school and I heard Jonathan talking in his annoying voice, I just let it go. It wasn't a big deal anymore, and I was strong enough to deal with it. And that's the lesson I learned. I learned it from Jonathan, but more, I learned it from the captain. And to this day, even as a grown man, all these years later, when some little thing is bothering me or annoying me, I think of how much worse things could be. And I just ignore that little thing. And even if I can't ignore it, I just keep my thoughts to myself. I keep it inside, and I put a smile on my face, and I worry about bigger things in the world. And you know what? When you act like things don't bother you, eventually they don't. So be strong and don't let little things annoy you. And that is all we have for this Warrior Kid podcast. Dave, thank you very much for coming on and sharing your stories with us. And if anyone out there wants to get one of the Warrior Kid books, you can get them at warriorkid.com. And if you want a Warrior Kid t-shirt or a Warrior Kid Jiu Jitsu rash guard, you can get one of them from jockostore.com. And if you start Jiu Jitsu or you already do Jiu Jitsu and you need a Jiu Jitsu gi for kids, you can get one of those at originmain.com. And that is it. Thanks for listening. Thanks for reading the books, and remember what I learned from the captain and from young Jonathan. Don't get annoyed. Be strong. Now go out there, train hard, study hard, work hard, get after it, and be a warrior kid.